So today I'm going to give you an introduction to the semester's class, Macroeconomics, ECO 201-0801 at the the City University of New York's Borough of Manhattan Community College. And this video will be an introduction to the class, a breakdown of why or what economics and macroeconomics is, why we want to study it or should want to study it, especially in the context of current events, and how I usually approach teaching this class in a more novel way than maybe is experienced by others who have taken economics classes before. So let's dive right in. Who am I? Well, my name is Jeffrey Mullings. I'm an economist at the Mayor's Office of Management and Budgeting in New York City. Also goes by the name OMB. I primarily forecast non-wage income for earners in New York City. I do forecasting in other components of our personal income tax regime, but what I specialize in is forecasting the non-wage components of income. So specifically things like capital gains that are usually earned on the sale of stocks or housing, bond sales, interest payments from bonds, other forms of fixed income, rental payments, those sort of things are what I basically focus on forecasting and trying to predict what portion of that income coming to New York City residents will be taxable by the city, so that we can inform the mayor and other officials about what the budget will look like for the city of New York in the next 2 to 5 years. To do this, I tap on skills I've learned on my own, but also through the CUNY system. I graduated with an MBA, a Master of Business Administration in Economics and Marketing from CUNY Baruch, and a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from Fordham University. If you're taking this class in person or at BMCC, you will see my email, my phone number on the syllabus. If you need to reach me for any reason, feel free to reach me by either approach. If you're reaching me by phone, I usually prefer text or SMS messaging. You can also reach out to me on Twitter at the handle at econmullings. So whichever approach really works for you, works for me. But that's just a little bit on who I am and why I'm here teaching the course. Now, let's start off with what is economics. I want to start off from a very basic place because regardless of whether or not you've taken an economics course before, I want you to kind of reserve the sentiments that you may have had from that class, because we're going to begin this anew, almost as if you have never taken an economics class before. My only assumption here is that you are a college, at least partially college educated individual. So some of the terminology I will be giving definitions to as I speak, but some terminology I may just presume you already have a working knowledge of. If you don't, reach out to me, or, use Google to also look up definitions. But for the most part, I'm going to try to make sure that I define a lot of the, especially econ-y keywords as we go along. But let's start off with just defining economics. What is economics? It's a study of managing limited resources in a sense. There is the reality that as aspiring people, we usually have unlimited wants, but the complementing reality is that we usually have limited resources for achieving those wants. And those resources can look like a lot of things, right? It can look like your time. It can look like literally the money in your wallet. It can look like your attention span, All of these things are limited resources in a sense. And the idea of economics is understanding how best to make choices about your limited resources so that you can achieve the outcome that provides you with the most utility, or provides whoever is making the choice with the most utility, most value. At a bare bones and at a very with a wide umbrella, that is what economics is. But again, that's a wide umbrella. So it can narrow down as far as like studying certain economic type of questions. So urban economics focuses a lot on economic questions in the context of cities and location, really. So you may have questions like how large or how many lanes a highway should have, but those questions may also interact with other components of the urban environment. So what will your lane decision for the highway, how will that impact the health outcomes for residents in the area? How will the housing in the area be impacted by the transportation decisions? And can the housing and its quality impact health outcomes? Where should this highway actually be located? Where will it do the least economic disruption? Where should your firm be located, depending on what type of good or service it's trying to sell and what type of inputs it uses to make that good or service? So those are the kind of questions you may end up getting in urban economics, which is different from the kind of questions you may get, for example, in monetary policy. So monetary policy studies questions that pertain a lot more to the money supply and how it could be used to control the economy. So you may have questions about what should be the percentage growth rate for the US dollar supply every year to try to manage both the need for an expanding currency along with the need to maintain a predictable amount of inflation each year. Should interest rates go into the negative? What is a negative interest rate, right? Should we monitor the unemployment rate to understand when we have put enough money into the economy? And if so, which unemployment rate? Should we monitor unemployment rates for women? Should we monitor unemployment rates for African Americans? So those are the type of questions you may get in monetary policy. And the picture you're looking at here, by the way, these are the gold bars at the the New York Federal Reserve Bank, only a few blocks away from BMCC. Economics can also get into more of the micro world, right? So micro world in the sense of how people interact with each other and how they make everyday kind of choices. So in this cartoon or this comic here, right, you're getting a idea that Homer is considering or reconsidering his choice for a snack in some ways because of the proximity of the fruits versus the donuts. And Apu is pondering the decision and the impact of the decision he's made to make the fruits or bring the fruits closer to the cash register and how that may influence Homer's eating habits. This is a bit of a venture down what we call behavioral economics. So in behavioral economics, we're seeking to modify the behavior of people as they interact with each other and with their environment. And it's usually through the use of things like nudges. So Apu isn't directly confronting Homer about his donut habit and how unhealthy saturated and trans fats are for his arteries. He is instead trying to make the fruit what we would call salient, trying to make the fruit very obvious and visible, which to a customer who is about to check out might be willing to notice the colorful fruit and actually pick it up as an additional item in their purchase. Or in this case, if the customer was already near the cash register and the unhealthy food is really put in a position where it's outside of the normal flow for the customer, you might influence the customer to say, well, that isn't really in my pattern. And even if they're not fully consciously thinking this, they might just consider getting the fruit because the donuts are literally a few steps further than they're willing to go. It may not be a conscious decision, but it might just be humans being their base self, where we, as many other animals do in nature, seek the easiest path through a challenge. So behavioral economics tries to take advantage of that humanness, that psychology that we display, and uses that to try to nudge us towards behaviors that should be better for everybody. And of course, there is classic game theory, which is also an area of economics that focuses on strategy, right? So what you're looking at is a matrix for a game we call chicken. And this game of chicken, what typically happens is that two people in muscle cars drive towards each other at a high speed. The point of the game is to see who is the first to swerve. And what you're looking at is the payoff matrix for player one, who's in blue, versus player two, based on their decisions in this game. The idea here is that either player's decision, it doesn't just happen in a vacuum. Or I should say the payoff from either player's decision isn't just determined in a vacuum. It's also in part determined by the decisions of their co-players, let's call it, because I don't want to say they're adversaries, because games aren't always adversarial, and that is a very important point in game theory. But in this case, it is kind of adversarial, and what you're seeing here is that if both players swerve, right, neither of them gets a payout because they both basically show that they are quote-unquote chicken. On the opposite end, though, if neither of them swerves or they both choose straight, then they get the worst payoff possible, which in real terms would be them both probably becoming terribly injured or murdered or killed by each other, because the cars would theoretically crash into each other if neither one swerves. Of course, if only one person makes a decision to swerve, the person who does make that decision is the one who receives a modestly negative payout, and the person who doesn't is the one who receives a positive payout. Both are modest in comparison to the worst outcome possible, which is that they both crash right into each other. So economics, while it is about, in some ways, achieving or satisfying our desires for unlimited things with the limited resources we have, that also takes the form of how we interact with each other and play games with each other. And to some sense, economics is also just, it really boils down to choices, because if we have these limited resources and we have these unlimited wants, what you're really in essence talking about are choices. And game theory makes it very clear by literally showing you what your choices are, what other people's choices may be, and what may happen as an outcome from that. So in some ways, it's really an essence of what happens in economics. And game theory and behavioral economics are probably going to be the pioneering future of the field in many ways, and for a few reasons. But let's move on to the broader kind of economics that we will be talking about, which is macroeconomics. Macroeconomics, as the word macro implies, is talking about more big picture questions. While economics may be just about this idea of limited resources and unlimited wants, and then microeconomics talks about how these choices for the things that are desired, or the choices for how to use those resources, it talks about how those choices are made in a more individual context and in context of people interacting with each other, companies interacting with each other. Macroeconomics asks questions more about how entire economies interact with each other and make choices within their jurisdiction in the context or with the understanding that they may have to interact with each other. So it's asking some larger questions that are more about the aggregate behavior of individuals or the cumulative behavior of individuals within and outside of an economy. One of those questions, for example, may pertain to inflation and what is the appropriate level of inflation. Inflation, of course, being the destruction of the value of the currency in your pocket. What determines inflation? Is it connected to the money supply? Is it connected to your Amazon account? Is it connected to your grandmother? These are it's a little tongue in cheek, but in many ways, these are the big questions around inflation in macroeconomics. And inflation in and of itself is one of the two large subjects in macro. The other one is unemployment. So questions surrounding unemployment may deal with or may pertain to what type of unemployment should we pay attention to? Should we pay attention to the amount of people who have very recently looked for a job and can't find any? Should we pay attention to people who are not looking for a job but may potentially look for a job if the income conditions were changed, the wage offerings were changed? Should we pay attention to the unemployment rates for the entire economy or for certain segments of the economy? Is it normal to have unemployment for the entire economy at a very low rate, but have unemployment for women or unemployment for African Americans to be much higher? Should we tolerate that? So those are some of the questions in macro, and you get this picture here in front of you of these two things, in this inflation rate and these people protesting for jobs, because this is really the dichotomy of what we're trying to balance in macroeconomics. We're trying to balance the level, you're trying to balance having an economy that can maintain a sustainable level of what we would consider full employment without triggering inflation rates that become so high that the value of the money in those workers' pockets starts to dwindle. So it's this big balance between jobs and maintaining the value of currency. Why is macroeconomics important, though, to understand? Like, it's one thing to understand what the two questions are, but why do we care about this balance of jobs and this deterioration of the value of money? Why do we care about how economies interact with each other and how people in the aggregate interact with each other in an economy? Let me take you down the road of why this is particularly important to understanding our position today in the United States. You're looking at a graph of income inequality in the US from 1910 to 2010. And the graph is specifically showing you on the y-axis, axis going up and down, the share of the top decile in national income. Translated, the share of national income earned by the top 10% of earners in the country. So, for example, in 1910, the share of income earned by the top 10% of earners in the United States was a little bit over 40%. That means the top 10% of the income distribution took in roughly, let's say, 41% of all the income earned in the country. By the late 1920s, that goes up to almost half. And so as that reads, yes, 10% of the entire population earned half the income in the population. We see that after the 30s, going into like the World War II era of the 1940s and thereafter, this income inequality, as defined by how much a small percentage of the population controls as far as income, started to fall. Income inequality started to drop, and you see that the top 10% of the distribution was really taking in roughly a third of the income, which is still unequal, but nowhere near the inequality seen during the Gilded Age, as we call it, the Roaring 20s, where wealth that in many ways was unlocked. It was unlocked through various mechanisms, but definitely also unlocked through the transmission of wealth from the dead to the survivors of the 1918 pandemic. How that era was marked by this high spiking inequality, wealth on top of wealth from income hoarded by the top 10% of the distribution. From the late 40s on to the late 70s, you see far less of that. And then suddenly, after the late 70s, income inequality starts to pick up again. And it becomes a trend, an upward trajectory of income inequality from the 80s till the 2010s, where we're really at a similar place to where we were in the 1920s. The Gilded Age period, where once again the top 10% of earners in the United States are taking in roughly half of the total income in the country. This is looking at it in the United States, and that is important because the U.S. offers a very specific attraction in that this is supposed to be the land of meritocracy. And there are some ways where we would try to define that meritocracy, right? One way would be the idea of a child of someone in the U.S. being better off than their parents as long as they, on average, exerted the same amount of effort, right? Even if they didn't, there's still kind of this American dream narrative that your child will be better off than you are. And what you see from this graph here, the inheritance of income status, your income as a parent is far more determinative of your child's income, and in a slightly negative sense. So the slope is, this is an upward sloping relationship between the y-axis, which is the average child income rank at age 30, so a little bit under what we would call mid-age, right? And the parent's income rank. First of all, the fact that this is like actually a slope and not just a non-linear trend of some sort is indicative to us that parents' incomes are predictive of a child's income. You are not so much a function of your own effort as much as you are a function of where your parents ended up, right around where they started to have you. And what you see here is that relationship, because that line slopes doesn't slope that steeply at all, this relationship is actually to the disadvantage of the child. A parent, for example, at the 60th income rank is probably going to have children who, on average, will be at the 50-something rank by age 30, kind of indicating that the children are doing moderately as well in some cases, if not worse. This is the complete antithesis of what would be expected from the American dream, where children would be performing better, right? Would be better off than their parents and have a high likelihood of being better off than their parents. Actually, that likelihood is not that high at all. As you see in this graph, called relative mobility rates are flat. The y-axis gives us the probability that a child will end up in the top fifth of the income distribution. And these colorful lines, each color represents the child when they were born who ended up in that specific quintile. So a quintile is a fifth of a population. So what this chart is showing us is, depending on which fifth of the population you ended up in, the bottom fifth, the top fifth, as far as where you were born at least, the bottom fifth, the top fifth, one of the middle fifths, depending on which one you ended up in, there's a certain percentage likelihood for each child's birth cohort, which is on the x-axis. There's a certain percentage likelihood that you will make it from that quintile to the top fifth. You may have noticed first is the blue quintile 1 line showing that if you were born in the bottom fifth of the population income distribution, born in the bottom 20%, you have a 10% chance of ever making it up to the top 20%. And keep in mind, the top 20% isn't even, we're talking about a country where the top 10% makes half the income. So your chances of even associating with them as someone born in the bottom 20% are very low. And this chance does increase modestly as you go up to different quintiles, but even for people in the top quintile, if a child born into the top 20% still only has roughly a 30% chance of remaining in that top quintile, which is fascinating because you would think with such stickiness, with such a challenge for the bottom child to get up to the top, that even the top child would probably remain up there more often. But as we go on in the class, you'll see that there are definitely circumstances where certain groups in the top percentiles are not as well protected amongst each other. What's startling about this chart, though, is how stagnant these probabilities have become since the 1980s. Children born in the 1980s and thereon have basically seen no variation really in their chances of becoming part of the top 20%. The chances weren't really that variable beforehand either. Like it looks like there is more volatility before the 80s, but in reality, all of these quintiles have basically been bouncing around an average since the 1970s. So mobility in the United States has been relatively flat. Like people born at the bottom of the chart do not have that much of a chance of making it up to the top, which again flies kind of in the face of the American dream concept. And it is not something that is just necessary for a functioning economy, right? Even if we were talking about just capitalist economies, the United States is relatively worse at mobility compared to even its neighbor 2 hours to the north of us in New York City by air flight, right? Like Canada, your chances of having a child in the bottom 20% and having that child come up to the top 20% of the income distribution are twice as high if you fly to Toronto and have the child there instead of in the United States. Other countries that you would consider in Europe as like complements to the US, like Denmark, the UK, also show higher rates of mobility for people at the bottom of the income distribution. So what is happening particularly in the United States that is so odd? Or maybe we should even ask, is this particular to the United States? I've shown you 3 other countries. Maybe this isn't just particular to the United States. Maybe the rest of the Anglo-Saxon world actually looks like this as well. So just looking even at Europe as a totality, the share of income that is controlled or earned by the top 10% is far lower in Europe than it is in the United States. US, we're closing in on 50% by 2010. At Europe, they're closing in on 35% by 2010. So a large gap there for comparable continental bodies, let's say. But even further, if we were really just to look at Anglo-Saxon nations, the United States still has a really high level of inequality compared to other English-speaking countries, right? So the share of the top 1% in total income is what's being measured on the y-axis. In other words, if we take the top 1% of each country's income distribution, how much of the total income in the country are they earning? In the United States, the top 1% earn almost 18% of the total income in the United States by 2010. In every other comparable English-speaking country, the UK, Canada, Australia, it is lower. The lowest is for Australia, where the top 1% seems to only own around 9% or control 9% of the income in the country. All these countries, though, experienced lower levels of inequality post World War II, and roughly around the 80s, started to see that inequality pick up, especially sharp pickups for the United States that carried on and were never really reversed. Why is this happening for the US? Is it maybe our minimum wage laws? An argument could be made, if you were to look at the minimum wage in France compared to the United States, for example, and control for inflation, so control for the increase in prices in the economy, which we do here by just looking at the minimum wage in terms of dollars in a single year in 2013 dollars. By controlling for inflation, what we can see is that France has actually had its minimum wage increase dramatically since the 70s, whereas the United States has seen a precipitous decline in its minimum wage from the late 70s and a flattening of the minimum wage roughly since the early 1990s. Maybe that is why. Is it because we're not supporting the bottom part of the income distribution as much with a fair or at least a dignified wage? Perhaps it's our income tax regime. So this is a good moment to just give you a quick briefer on how income taxes work. Income taxes you should think of as a jar and water, with the water being your income. And you have the water in a, let's say, pot or something, or you're just pouring water out from the faucet and you're trying to get it into this jug. And this jug has notches, right? Or this jar has notches. Now you pour the water in, and as you're pouring, the water that goes up to the first notch, untaxed. All of that water is yours. You don't have to worry about giving any part of that water to the government. But then the water between the first notch and the second notch, well, that water you have to give about 5% of it, let's say, to the government in taxes. Okay. Now the water between the third notch and the fourth notch, that water you have to give 10% of it. So only 10% of the water between that third and fourth notch, not any of the other notches below it. Okay, all right, and so on and so forth until you get to a very top notch. And basically the water between that top notch and the second highest notch would be taxed at what we call the top marginal tax rate. So what you're looking at here is the top marginal income tax rate. This is the top rate that any person in this country or in the countries being observed would face if they made the most amount of income that would reach that top rate. So it could vary, but based on the mobility data that we saw previously, there are very few people in the United States who would really have to worry about this very top rate. And you can set where the notches are. So you can determine how much water or income it takes for somebody to actually get up to the point where they're taxed at this very highest rate of income. And only then every dollar that they make over that threshold, let's say you make the threshold $600,000 and the top rate is 10%. Well, then 10% will only be taxed on every dollar that the person makes over $600,000. In comparable Western developed countries to the United States, you see marginal tax rates in the 40s to the late 70s that are relatively high. You see that the United Kingdom has a marginal tax rate in that period nearing the 90s to 100% level, right? Which almost becomes a cap on wages or a cap on income, because if you're making $1 million and at the $1,000,001 you are going to get taxed on that dollar at 99 cents, it's a real disincentive for you to try to make any more money than $1 million. What's the point when that extra dollar that you make, 90% of it is going to go to the government? And you see similar rates in other parts of the world. The United States has that rate at almost 90% for a good part of that period. In France, the rate may not have been as high, but 60% is still very high compared to what's going on in countries today. And in Germany, that rate was close to around 50 or above 50% as well. But you see a similar trend to what we've seen in other charts where the 80s hit and there's just a drop in top tax rates. And looking at 2013, right, you're seeing a top tax rate for earners that's closer to 40%. Today, it's closer to like the mid 30s, really, if you're talking about the effective top tax rate in the United States, compared to France, still around the 50s percentage. Germany is below where it was post World War II, but still higher than the US and comparable to the UK, which is closer around the high 40s. It's possible that by reducing the incentive by reducing the disincentive, I should say, to make outrageous amounts of income, we have created an environment where hoarding income is not as costly as it used to be. And as a result, the inequality in how much of the income goes to certain portions of the distribution is much higher than it used to be. All of this matters, though, because these are measures of the American dream. And in many ways, it's an American dream that's deteriorating, if not failing now. The most vivid way to understand this failure is just by asking what percentage of children make more than their parents. In the 1940s, that percentage was closer to 90%. 90% of children in the United States made more money than their parents. By the 1980s, that drops around 50%. And it's been roughly around that point since then. There's basically a coin flip chance that your child will make more money than you. And that is a major letdown for somebody whose parents may have come to the United States with the entire intention of creating opportunity for their children, understanding that it may in many ways have been not necessarily too late, but it may not be as advantageous for them to find the benefits in the U.S. economy, to find the liberties in the U.S. economy, as much as it would be for their children, the choices that their children would be able to make in the future that would be wider ranging and have higher income potentials than the choices that they were able to make in their countries with their levels of capital and with their regulations and laws. But that dream is fading in many ways, and now it's really a coin flip chance if you coming to the United States, being in the United States means that your child will be better off than you. This lack of mobility, this income inequality, but specifically this lack of upward mobility, especially for the children that we've been looking at, isn't uniform across the country. That's to say, what we are talking about are, yes, declining rates of social mobility, declining moments of opportunity. But these declines, this deterioration of the American dream isn't happening everywhere in the United States. It's happening and clustering in certain parts of the country. You can see that with this heat map, where the darker parts of the map indicate areas where people are far less socially mobile at the bottom part of the income distribution. So if your parent was in the bottom 25th percentile, the bottom quarter of the income distribution, bottom quarter of the population in earners, what is your rank as your parent's child when you reach to basically almost mid-age? Do you end up also in the 25th percentile? Do you end up above the 25th? Do you end up below it? What we see from this heat map is that in the darker areas, people end up roughly around the same place as their parents, or just modestly better than their parents were. So in the deep south regions in Mississippi, Georgia, the Carolinas, Florida, you see that most children are ending up in the same part of the income distribution as their parents, regardless of the fact that time is moving on and income and opportunity should be growing for them as time goes on. But you can see in the Northeast and along the coast, especially on the West, that isn't the same story. Children born in these areas are at least modestly likely to do better than their parents. born into poverty in the New York region, and you may still make it up to roughly the 50th percentile. If you're in the right part of New York, or perhaps even in, I should say, in the right part of Pennsylvania, you might make it up to 60th percentile of the income distribution. That is not necessarily an American dream as much as it is clusters of American dreams and wider ranging issues with social mobility in parts that are not as economically benefiting. We'll learn more in the class about why opportunity clusters in some parts of the country rather than others. But I do want to point you to one thing that is a very clear proxy or a very clear similarity with the trends that you see on this heat map. And that is the distribution or the concentration of people by race in the United States. I want you to pay particular attention to the green along this deep south that you see in this map here. That green is concentration of African or Black Americans in different parts of the rural South. And it's part of the story of the United States where race and inequality are pretty much hand in hand. And they are hand in hand through the mechanisms of discrimination. You'll see in this class how these things intersect and why it matters. But here, very clearly, is a big part of why it matters, because a large part of the inequality that we are experiencing in the United States is happening in areas that are predominantly Black. And that's not to say they're exclusively Black. There are clearly white residents scattered through some of these areas who are also experiencing similar outcomes to their Black neighbors. But that speaks to how the United States history of segregation and how that segregation took on not only a racial lens, but also a geographic lens that focused on race, how much that has hurt certain parts of the country to the extent that mobility and opportunity is basically impossible to find in these areas. Another reason to consider why the Black experience may highlight for us how income inequality or why income inequality is so bad in the U.S. and why mobility is so stagnant is because the Black unemployment rate has never been comparable to the white unemployment rate in the United States, regardless of how well the U.S. economy has done. What you're looking at here is the gap between the two. So this is the percentage point difference between the Black unemployment rate and the white unemployment rate. The positive numbers on the y-axis indicate that this rate for African Americans, Blacks or African Americans, has always been higher than the unemployment rate for whites since this data has been measured in the 70s. We will get into why this persists for so long, but I want you to appreciate that between recessions, and recessions are indicated by the shaded regions on this graph, between recessions, even when the U.S. economy starts to boom and benefit, the rate for this group for African Americans only declines so much, or only closes the gap with whites so much. And the gap is never fully closed. It was the most closed it has ever been since measurements in the last few years. But as you can see towards the tail end there, that quickly reversed itself with the lockdown, the great lockdown of 2020. Why is this happening now? To understand that, we can't necessarily just look at a snapshot of now. We have to understand the historical context of what's been happening with the economy. What you're looking at is a breakdown of the value of different kinds of capital in the U.S. from 1770 to 2010. In 1770, slaves who were predominantly, virtually all African American, or I should say all African in the United States, were valued at 1.5 times the national income. That is to say that the total value of slaves in the U.S. was larger than the total amount of income circulating in the country. That is important because capital is opportunity in many ways. And the idea that not only was a certain subset of the US economy not considered human, but capital, and then also capital for another subset of the economy, that doesn't just go away without some deep repairs. Capital offers opportunities not just to control the means of production in an economy, the means of making goods and services, but capital also can be borrowed against. So capital is a way to expand someone's income. Because if you own capital, if you own a house, you own a car, you can borrow money against that and use that money to expand your current consumption abilities. In many ways, this speaks to why the inequality has been so bad in the United States. A subset of the country are literally descendants of people who were not only denied access to capital, but were themselves considered capital, which means that they didn't require compensation. They started out from behind, not only from behind the eight ball, but also with the entire game set up in favor of the people who owned them as capital holders. And while none of these people specifically are alive today, their descendants and the outcomes of their decisions of what to do with their money have had ripple effects onto today, as has the denial of access to capital for Africans and their descendants. We see that today in some ways through the gap in family wealth between whites and non-whites, and specifically whites and blacks. In 1963, that gap was roughly $45,000 for whites versus non-whites as far as wealth. Today, that gap is almost $150,000. 10 times more wealth exists in the median white household than in the median black household. We use medians in this case to control a bit for outliers. So using the median instead of the average eliminates or greatly reduces the effect of people like the wealthiest of the country, who are also far wealthier than the average person in the country. So controlling for that, we still see this massive gap in the wealth between blacks and whites, and a lot of that is due to home ownership and who actually outrightly owns their home and therefore is entitled to the full value of their home versus people who are still renters or are in the process of trying to pay off their home, but because of income issues are having a slow time, if not an impossible time doing that. This is looking at this wealth division between 1963 and 2016. It has only grown worse since then, and it grows particularly worse through recession. So we can only imagine how the great 2020 lockdown will affect this gap. Now, to get to the classic reason why we study macroeconomics, the classic reason is because we want to avoid recessions. We want to avoid these gray areas because these gray areas are where things get really bad for people. Recessions create forms of turmoil and suffering that we do want to avoid just in general for an economy. But I would like to particularly highlight for you that one of the reasons why it is particularly important for people to study macroeconomics is because, and this, I should say, people who are minorities and underprivileged groups or just underrepresented groups, is because they are usually the most inflicted by recessions. You can see here the unemployment rate for African Americans and for high school graduates without a college degree skyrocketed during the Great Recession of 2008-2009. We can only imagine how these groups will be impacted by the latest recession based on data on which jobs are being lost and who the losers of those jobs are, right? We're looking at job losses today that concentrate during the great 2020 lockdown that are concentrated among women among women of color in particular, and among women of color who are around the age 25 and younger. So they are also probably high school graduates or people who have only attained some college education. And that matters because we're seeing today with the great 2020 lockdown just what does happen when people start to feel like their economy is failing them. The combination of discrimination and a lack of opportunity, inequality, leads people to make decisions that can become chaotic for the entire society. It leads people to lose faith that democracy and voting actually has an impact on their outcome when over half of the income in their country is controlled by an elite 10% of people. And they also start to question whether or not the people who are supposed to handle some form of this inequality with their tax system, theoretically, if they're using that taxation and redistribution system fairly. Should we be spending so much money on police officers when people are hungry, when people are going without housing, when people are sick and the possibility of them getting care may mean them going bankrupt and losing all of their wealth and all their income opportunities? These are natural questions for us to have when a society starts to experience a deep recession, and they're in many ways not new at all. Looking at the 1970s and then on, similar questions were asked when the economy took rough times and rough hits. In 1977, when the city was barely at all recovering from its fiscal crisis, a blackout occurred, rioting happened, looting happened. All these things that are kind of symptomatic of an economy that is failing its people has occurred before. These questions about how resources are used by the government after they're taxed from us in an environment where so few people have so much of the income also did exist before, even if it was in the form of NWA's Fuck the Police album. It's effectively the same question as defund the police, right? Or as the same concept as defund the police. Why are certain decisions being made with the limited resources we have when we see the economic outcomes for the majority of people is effectively what is being asked and has been asked since income inequality started increasing in the United States in the late 70s. And these questions will probably continue to be asked until we handle the real problem with the American economy, which hopefully you will get a better idea of what that is as we go through the semester. So pivoting, why do we want to study economics at all? I argue that us studying economics only matters if we intersect it with something else. The study of how limited resources are used to try to attain some unlimited wants is nearly useless to boring without the intersection of areas like sociology, psychology, finance, governance, or even biology. And that's why I try to intersect and use a multidisciplinary approach in teaching this class. So, getting right on to that, let's start off first with a little bit of Zoom etiquette. This video is being filmed during the great 2020 lockdown, and this is, for many instructors, including myself, the first time doing a formally distanced learning curriculum. So a few things off the ground rules. I would encourage you to share video, as in actually have your video camera on when you come to class, although it's not a requirement for every class. I understand that we are, in many cases, experiencing day-to-days that can vary in how we feel and are impacted, and sometimes even being in our home, it's hard for me to resist that some people are going to just have a day where they're going to want to be in their underwear and just trying to get through class with the least pain possible. And I appreciate that. I would ask that if you are feeling up to it and you are able to, that you do share video. It's a little different teaching to a whole bunch of black boxes, and I would love to see who my students are and just get the the closest that we can to the normal interaction between student and professor in the classroom. If you're going to share video, which you only need to do for your presentation, right? Everybody is going to do a presentation in the class. The presenter has to share video. Make sure that your background is appropriate before logging into the Zoom meeting. So just make sure that, you don't have a shot that goes down the hallway of your apartment and none of your family members know, and then somebody steps out of a bedroom in full glory. That's not necessarily what anybody wants to experience. I want to protect your family's privacy as much as they want to protect theirs. So just make sure that you find a blank wall or something that is, completely PG and fine for your background when you come into class and share video. I would appreciate if you kept the microphone muted, just so that we can reduce ambient noise. But it is just to reduce ambient noise. I don't want the muted mic to deter you from participating in class. You can definitely use the raise hand button in Zoom, and I just ask that if you're not in the process of speaking or in the process of asking a question, that you do keep the mic off, just so that we don't get a whole bunch of random background noise for the entire class. It would also be appreciated if you didn't share your screen unless you were presenting. So sharing your screen being different than sharing video, right? Video is just of you as a person in front of your computer. Sharing your screen would mean sharing your desktop, so allowing us to see what's on your desktop and such, which doesn't seem to be necessary unless you're doing a presentation, in which case we'd have to see your PowerPoint. Zoom has a raise hand button, so you can use that to be recognized to participate in class. And if you can't do video or mic for asking a question, you can also ask a question via the chat and type it in. But the chat should only be used for classroom discussions and questions. Don't use it for side conversations. And, typical college rules. You don't have to ask me if you can go to the bathroom, eat, or drink. It is your home. You are completely in right to do that. Just make sure that if you do step away from your keyboard, or if you are eating or drinking, that your microphone is off, and especially if you stepped away from the keyboard, that your video is off. I ask for the microphone to be off just so that we don't hear the clanking of the plates or anything that would be indicative that you're doing something else that's noisy. And the video to be off because if you walk away from the keyboard, I don't want to see a random shot of somebody who may not have been prepared to be on camera just walking into your shot, because now your head's no longer there to block the passageway, right, or video of the passageway. But also because you don't want to end up in a situation where perhaps you forget that you had your video on and you decide to take your laptop with you to the bathroom. That we're just trying to avoid as much embarrassing and privacy invading situations as possible. So just when you are momentarily distracted dealing with something, I understand we're all in our homes right now, just take the time to turn off your microphone and turn off video. So the general course objectives. What are we going to be working on in the class? We're going to be working on managing limited resources, persuasive speaking, information presentation, critical thinking, and Microsoft Excel / spreadsheet software exposure. Not going to be really working on that. I'm going to try my best to expose you to this. I'll talk more about that in a second. Anyway, managing limited resources. So that really takes the form of understanding how the midterm, the final, and attendance are looked at, or participation is looked at. The midterm is 29 points out of 100. It will be 1 hour to 1 hour and 15 minutes. It will be 36 questions. It will be on chapters 1 through 9 with 4 questions coming from each chapter. And it will be all multiple choice. Now I'll follow up with other details. Now, the final is also 29 points out of the 100 total for the class, right? So both of these are 29 points each. For the entire class, this is scored out of 100. So you can get 29 points from the midterm, 29 points from the final. The final will be 1 hour long, 40 questions. It will not be cumulative, so it'll only be talking about the chapters after the midterm. And it'll also be all multiple choice. And other details will follow as we get closer to the exams. Finally, for this section, participation is 16 points out of the 100 points. And I don't really go by the whole 3 days absent, you're out type of situation. I basically deduct a point or 0.6 of a point, really, specifically, for every day that a student isn't participating as and is absent. So it's really about you managing your time. If you have a priority that's really going to keep you away from class, I don't want to be in between you and that priority. If it is more important than the class at that time, which it can happen. I've had professors in my experience who have deluded themselves into believing that nothing is more important than class time. And honestly, if your grandmother's on her diet or on her deathbed, I am not going to be the person to be between you and your grandmother. So we're all adults, right? We're all adults in this class. Manage your time wisely. If you need to take time to deal with a personal matter, your grade will take a minor hit, but it is not going to be so major. Like, I don't do, as you'll see in a second, this class is very low stakes in many ways. So I'm not trying to fail you as much as I'm trying to create an environment where you focus mostly on learning and learning how to learn. So with that said, study smart, not hard. Studying smart starts in the classroom by taking notes and asking questions. This is how we stay engaged with the material, and this is how we make sure that we know that what we understand from the material is correct, by engaging in the class, taking notes, and asking the right questions. Manage your time. Don't cram for the tests. The campus is littered with students who have crammed for my test and failed as a result. Don't be one of them. The time for preparing for a test starts in the classroom with taking notes, asking questions, and of course doing your reading when that time comes up. And then when the test gets closer, you're supposed to just reinforce what you've already been building on with more focused relearning and more focused memorization to an extent. But understand, the class is low stakes. You can fail either test and still pass a class, albeit with a mediocre grade. You can still pass the class. So I don't want you to feel like there's a situation where if you don't pass every single test, or if you don't pass the first test, you are automatically screwed. You can still pass the class. You just need to work your butt off to do well in the other components. And I've had plenty of students who have done that and have made miraculous recoveries that both I and them are proud of. Or I should say I and they are proud of. Also be working on building slides and presenting information and speaking persuasively, your homework. So usually I have students pick between one of two options with the ability to do something I call a policy prompt presentation. That's canceled this semester. The policy prompts will be mostly replaced with discussions in class. Instead, every student will be assigned through a process that I will elaborate more on Blackboard and an email sent out to the students. They'll each be assigned a chapter to present on. You'll be presenting one of the chapters and pretending to teach, and those are strong air quotes because you're not actually going to be teaching the class. I will be there every step of the way, interrupting you to clarify things, to make sure that I add information to what you are saying. You're really just getting practice at teaching someone else what you just learned. And that is because I am a strong believer that the best way to learn something is to try to tell somebody else about what you just learned. You realize very quickly where your gaps in knowledge are when you have to explain something to someone else. And I think this is the best opportunity to do so. One, because I don't actually grade you on your understanding of the chapter. What you'll see in the grading rubric next is that there's no part of the grading rubric that pertains to your understanding. So it's entirely fine if you misunderstand something or if you make a mistake. I am actually hopeful for that because mistakes and misunderstandings are opportunities for us to correct things that you probably weren't the only person to misunderstand. It's very likely that your peers also didn't understand what you made the mistake on, and they may have not been as brave as you to be up in front of the class or to make it as obvious that they didn't understand. So we're really just learning from each other through this process, and you're learning from the process yourself by understanding where your gaps in knowledge lie. Don't be so bold as to think that you have nothing to learn from trying to explain something to someone else. The maximum for this presentation is 20 minutes. So the other practice here is learning how to take a large amount of information and make it concise in a way that meets these grading rubric standards, which will test your ability, or at least assess your ability to be coherent while being concise. So the grading rubric specifically, I grade on timeliness, which is a basic question of were you ready to present when your name was called? The quality and coherence of your slides. So could I follow what was going on in the slides in a way that made sense, was coherent, created maybe even a narrative around the topic? The coherence of how you presented them. So did you present them in a way where it at least seemed like you read what you were presenting on? Even if you completely misunderstand things, even if you make a complete network of misunderstandings, I would prefer that you made a coherent network of misunderstandings that we can correct together than the obvious that somebody kind of just skimmed the chapter and was just trying to throw out terms that they saw in the chapter. Make sure that this makes sense. What you are presenting makes sense, even if it's wrong, that it makes sense in how it's wrong. And also the breadth of coverage. So don't skip a vital part of the chapter. Don't skip an entire section. That is quite frustrating when a student clearly didn't get through the entire reading for the only chapter they're assigned and they left it completely off of the slides. Because now I don't know how well the student understood this section. I don't know if they avoided it just because they didn't understand it. And that leaves way too much room for questioning and guessing, where I'm trying to make the class time as effectively useful as possible for you as a student, so that we focus on the areas that you don't understand and we work on building those understandings, as well as working on building your ability to learn without being told what you should be learning, your ability to grapple with information in a critical way, which we'll focus on in a bit. But I just have a few points here for a good PowerPoint. And really, they summarize as engage with the audience and engage with the material you're working on, right? Don't just throw things onto a slide and then walk up in front of the class, literally read off the slides word for word, or read off of a script word for word. Unless, I understand when English is a second language for some students, that may be an issue. That is appreciable, but just try to avoid moments or things that make it hard for you to connect to the people you're presenting to. Because I also want you to practice presenting information in a persuasive way. And part of being persuasive is making contact with your audience. You want your audience to feel like they are feeling the energy of how compelled you are by the material. And even though this may not be the most compelling material because it's a chapter in a textbook, it's a great time to practice. So moving on from there. While we were talking about critical thinking, let's talk more about it. Learning how to think, not what to think. So analysis requires you to engage in critical thinking about the information you're receiving. And that critical thinking means asking questions like, does the information make sense in the context of what you already know about something? And if it doesn't make sense, asking yourself, what would have to change about what you thought you knew about something for this to make sense? If that change is very big, then maybe you should ask more questions to interrogate whether or not this new information actually makes sense. How many orders of effects will this new information have? So who does it impact beyond the people immediately obvious? And we'll do a little quick example of what I mean by orders in a second. But also you want to ask yourself, how reliable is information? Is it coming from a source that creates reputable information regularly, or is it coming from an Instagram account? Can it be closely replicated? Like the information that you're looking at or reading, can you actually try to do the things that are being described here and come to the same conclusion, or go through the logic of what they're going through and come to the same conclusion? And finally, does the source of information contain any biases, or was there any bias in how the information was collected? Is an important thing to understand, right? It's very often that political biases seep into information, especially on the internet, and it's critical that you understand how to differentiate reliable information from partisan propaganda. Finally, can you use theories or concepts from other disciplines to create dependable theories around this new information? So this idea of integrating your learning in totality, right? You're learning from different areas and different studies, because the ideal here is that you would integrate and intersect these studies to be a more wholly rounded person, capable of not just regurgitating information, but also analyzing new problems, unprecedented problems like the ones we deal with today, to come at them with innovative, useful, creative, groundbreaking solutions. And that starts from really intersecting the information that you know to come to better and deeper understandings. So, examples of critical thinking in action: you see an elephant and a rhino are fighting, and you wonder what happens to the insects and the vegetation below them. So you think about more than just what's most salient. You think about the other orders of effects. If these two beasts are fighting here, what, as a consequence, happens? You wonder if the Rothschilds own the Federal Reserve and all of the global banks. And you realize that the world's largest banks are all public. The members of the Federal Reserve Board are public, as well as the institution itself is public, which would probably make it very hard for a private family to have significant control over it that wouldn't be detected by somebody. And you might also consider that there has historically been unfounded anti-Semitic theories of Jewish families controlling global finance, and that this might just be a new iteration of the same trope of anti-Semitic theories of Jews controlling the global financial system. You see the recent trade issues between the US and China, and you use your history class to wonder if the outcome will be similar to the Opium Wars between China and the West, which also started largely from a framework of China being one of the global economic powerhouses and the UK being a rivaling global economic powerhouse. So this is really like a crash course in thinking about critical thinking. We will practice a lot more of this as the semester goes on. And you'll learn Excel through some of the examples, and this is to just say I'm going to make in-class games using both Microsoft Excel and Google Docs' Google Spreadsheets, which are both spreadsheet softwares. One is cloud, Google, and the other one is from Microsoft. And I'll be using these to make games and leaving it open for you after the game so that you can see how some of the actions that were done in the Excel sheets were done, see what formulas were used and what processes were used. And, it may be lucrative to get a grasp around Microsoft Excel and spreadsheet software independently. BMCC offers free classes in Microsoft Office programs, including Excel, and I have had students unlock very lucrative career opportunities just on the basis of having an Excel background, even with their having the same educational credentials as most of my students have coming into my classroom. Excel, spreadsheet software, these are almost expected of anybody in the modern workforce. The understanding of these is almost expected of anybody in the modern workforce. So the faster that you start to embrace using this software, the better your chances are of unlocking a job opportunity in the future. So finally, the complete rubric: 26 points for the homework presentation, 29 points for the midterm, 29 points for the final, and 16 points for the participation component. Means 100 points total earnable in the class. And of course, again, you could fail any one of these components and still pass a class if you just really kick butt at the other components. So everybody isn't a test taker. If you're not a test taker, try to kick butt at the presentation. If you are a good presenter, test taker, then maybe you should also make sure you just come to class regularly. I'm trying to leave opportunities for people to succeed here. And part of success also involves doing the reading. So I have points here on speed reading tactics. I'm not going to go line by line through them, but you should make sure that you come to class with the reading done. This is not going to be one of those classes where we basically spend a large amount of time in class just summarizing the chapter. What we're going to be doing a lot in class is trying to enhance your understanding of the chapter and to try to identify areas of the chapter where you are struggling to grasp things. And I try to take the easiest routes to doing that, the shortest routes to doing that, because frankly, we are dealing with roughly almost 30 people, an average of 30 people in a classroom, and it's impossible to identify every single person's weakness. But what we can do is try to get broad strokes of understanding of where people are weak and try to buffer those up and hope that there are splash effects on others for other areas where they may have had minor questions or weaknesses. But that all starts from that root all comes from the seed of you doing your reading every time before class and making sure you actually read and take notes. Taking notes is critical because that is one of the best ways to retain the information that you're reading. It's very challenging to expect anybody to do as much reading as you will be doing across your classes and retain information from that reading without having taken notes. So take notes not only in class, but also through the reading, right? You should be taking notes in reading or from the reading and then coming to class and jotting down insertions into your notes from points that you saw were highlighted in class or explained better in class. So you get an idea of not only what's in the reading, but also where things will be focused on in the future. So to help you in that focus around these chapters, there will be at times mandatory chapter reflections. They'll be assigned digitally via Google Forms, and they're supposed to they will be evaluated on the quality of your answers, not necessarily the accuracy. I like to say that there are no wrong answers, just thoughtless ones, because I'm not asking in these chapter reflections for you to give me what is the correct answer. Many times there is not a correct answer. I'm asking you to give me an answer that you think is right and to justify why you think it's right. And the answer is usually based on something going on in the chapter. Answer won't be found per se in the chapter, but it'll be found through your wrangling and your critical analysis of what you just read in the chapter. These reflections don't add to your grade, but if you don't complete them, they will subtract points from either your midterm or your final, depending on whichever one is the closer test. And the only person excused from a mandatory reflection is the person who is presenting the chapter that reflection is on that day. So, for example, if we were to have a reflection on Chapter 1, the person who's presenting Chapter 1 would not have to do the reflection. I also include bonus levels. So, bonus levels are usually 3 question quizzes that I give at the start of class, digitally via Google Forms, and you have about 5 minutes to complete the bonus level. It is an extra credit opportunity with no downside. It is only designed to reward people who read regularly and come to class on time. The questions will be very basic and are usually very easy to answer if you've done the reading prior to class, but will be more challenging to just look up in the 5-minute time frame. So I'm really trying to reward people for keeping up with the readings by having these bonus levels at random times. And the thing is, there's no risk in that any question you get wrong in the bonus level will not deduct points from any part of your grade. But every question you get right will add extra credit points. So if there's no other reason to keep up with the reading, it's because I may pop up a bonus level and you might miss an opportunity to get some easy extra credit points for literally having done nothing but kept up with the reading. So let's just go over the final breakdown of how the class will usually flow. This isn't a mandatory timetable, but it is what I'll try to keep us to. So the first 5 minutes, usually a grace period where we either discuss news, the latest information out there in economics, or a bonus level. After that, spend maybe around 10 minutes going over the last night's reading, or open questions about last night's reading, or over the mandatory reflection. Spend the next 20 minutes on the presentation of last night's chapter from the student who was assigned that presentation. And then another 5 minutes going over any questions that may have come up after the presentation that were inspired by the presentation. Maybe there was something that was presented that you're like, oh, I thought X, Y, and Z, and we go through that. Another 30 minutes, so we'll either use for an in-class activity, games or such, or a presentation that I may want to do, followed by questions and reflections on the game or presentation. And then finally, let's get to what the homework will be. So first homework, read chapter 1 and answer the career link question on Blackboard. It's going to ask you about how you think economics could help you in your career. So that is your first homework, is to read chapter 1 and answer that career link question. Your first extra credit opportunity is also available. It will be doing a reflection on, or answering questions reflecting on Appendix A. So the link to this extra credit has been emailed out to you. It is also on Blackboard in the extra credit section of the Blackboard. And yeah, any question you get right on that Appendix A questioning will only add points to your exam. Any question you get wrong will not deduct any points. So that extra credit is just an opportunity to add points to your midterm exam. And just a warning to Chapter 2's presenter, don't wait until the last minute. Make sure you start looking at what Chapter 2 is about. Try to start outlining what you think a presentation will look like. You'll see what I do for presenting Chapter 1 to get an idea of how I try to focus on certain things in the chapter and what things you may want to focus on in your analysis of the chapter and your presenting of your chapters. But start from now just looking at what Chapter 2 is and seeing what the highlighted keywords are, what the chapter is about. Try to get an idea of what type of presentation you're going to flow together. So that is all that I have for this first day. It will be an exciting semester. I promise you that you will get an economics course that you have never had before. We will intersect economics with a lot of real world experiences and situations and try to get a deeper understanding of how our management of resources and the choices we make with those resources have an impact not just on our economy, but on other economies as well, and how it has an impact on different groups within our economy. Who has the wealth and who doesn't? Who has access to income and who doesn't? And why those choices exist, and perhaps how we can make better choices in the future that allow us to manage our economy in a way where we avoid recessions and guarantee some level of equality, or at least some level of opportunity and mobility for people who are willing to put in the effort and work for it. I hope you are as excited as I am to explore these questions. See you on the other side.